Leslie Weinstein, which many of you have heard before. So without further ado, I will turn it over to her.
Hi, Martin. Thank you so much. So for this session, I'm going to turn off my camera just because I make weird faces when I try to focus on small things. So apologize for that. But otherwise, I will guide you through identifying CUI. So the first thing I do at the start of all of these is kind of teeing up where we are in the timeline of CMMC and reminding everybody that the reason why we're talking about CMMC with CUI is because the CMMC exists to protect CUI, and the CUI program started in 2010 as part of an executive order. And since then, the DoD has been publishing acquisition regulations, with the last one going into effect in late 2025, which means we are going to start seeing the CMMC defers clause in solicitations and contracts, and it's important to understand what CUI is and how it relates specifically to the CMMC. So today's call is all about CMMC scoping. In the terms of CMMC, so I've worked with several compliance frameworks and assessment frameworks, and they all say the same words, but the words mean slightly different things. So for the CMMC, scoping refers to identifying and classifying your assets within your environment according to their relationship with CUI. And their relationship with CUI also determines the level of assessment that each of these assets will be given. So starting off, out of scope assets, the assets that do not fall anywhere within these types of assets, they don't handle CUI, they're physically or logically separated from the CUI assets. So these do not exist anywhere in the CUI or CMMC ecosystem. They're considered out of scope. They're not assessed against the CMMC standards. But these types of assets, and these are DoD's definitions of assets, you will want to use their definitions because they are the ones driving the CMMC program. But this is how they have defined the various types of assets that exist within your information system where the CUI resides. So the very first type of asset is a CUI asset. These are the IT systems, so endpoints, servers, anything that touches CUI, that handles, processes, stores CUI, these are CUI assets. The next category is the security protection assets. These are the things that provide security functions or capabilities to those CUI assets. So things like routers, firewalls, those kinds of things, they provide security functions or capabilities to these CUI assets directly. This next group is called contractor risk managed assets. These are the computers, laptops, the things that are not supposed to handle CUI, but they're in your environment. They have the capability of handling CUI, like a laptop can handle CUI, but if that laptop is assigned to a human who doesn't have any reason to be accessing CUI as part of their job and really should never see CUI, they're in your environment. So these endpoints will be included as part of your CMMC scope, but we'll talk about on the next slide why it's important to identify these specific assets and manage them through security policies, procedures, and practices to ensure that those endpoints and those devices do not receive CUI, because if they do receive CUI, then these contractor risk managed assets would then become CUI assets. So understanding who handles CUI and who doesn't handle CUI will help make a determination between these two categories of assets. And then this last category are assets that can process, store, transmit CUI, but they're not able to be fully secured because NIST 800-171 is designed for traditional IT information systems like computers and servers. But specialized assets are things like wearables, potentially like a Fitbit or some other sort of thing that doesn't lend itself nicely to NIST 800-171 set of controls. So these are specialized assets. They still need to be identified and talked about in your system security plan, but they will not be able to receive the same level of control implementation as a traditional IT asset. So why does it matter that we truly understand each asset and what it does related to CMMC? And it's because of this column right here. And this, again, is straight from the CMMC Level 2 Scoping Guide. So The CUI assets, you document it in your asset inventory, you identify it in the SSP, all the things, and then you assess all of these against the CMMC level 2 security requirements. The security protection assets, these are the ones that provide security directly to the CUI assets. You're only going to assess those against the relevant controls, relevant to the capabilities that are provided, right? So you don't assess all of the NIST controls. It's just the ones that are relevant to providing security to those CUI assets. Contractor risk managed assets. They tell you that you identify it in your SSP and your asset inventory, all the same things as a CUI asset, except for you document it. You explain how you have prevented CUI from reaching these devices, whether through a company policy, like on a piece of paper, or a policy in a system to not allow that endpoint to access where the CUI is, or some other sort of mechanism, some procedure to ensure that these endpoints and these devices do not actually receive CUI. So within the scoping guide, it does say that if for some reason your assessor doesn't find your documentation sufficient to eliminate the risk with these things being in the CUI environment, they're allowed to do spot checks, limited spot checks that should not, quote, materially increase the assessment duration nor the cost. So as long as you're documenting these things sufficiently in your system security plan, you should not need to have those things assessed against the CMMC requirements. So again, just to highlight the value add for truly understanding who handles CUI and who doesn't, because it can mean having that endpoint subject to a CMMC assessment and we're not, right? So assessment or not. And then same thing with specialized assets, understanding which are specialized and not inadvertently putting them in the CUI category, or even necessarily the contractor risk managed asset. If you know that it handles CUI, you need to be talking about that in your system security plan, because it will give your assessor an extra level of confidence that you truly understand and grasp the nature of the assets and the CUI in your environment. Okay, so the goal here is to figure out where CUI resides in your environment. The last presentation I gave talked about this and how to, at a high level, scope your environment, right? Because you're really concerned with how the government sends you CUI and maybe where you send it and maybe how you use it and where you store it and who's touching it. All of this is included in your CUI scope. You have to understand how you're sending it. You have to understand how you're receiving it from the government, and then understanding how you're using it with your environment. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. So these questions over here are the high-level questions you should be thinking about in the beginning when you're first starting this exercise. Understanding what product or service or information that you're providing to the government under a contract. And I point out the contract requirement because information that the government is not asking you for is not CUI. So when the CUI categories were first published, the category of privacy is in there. But we all have privacy data, and our companies that we work for have our privacy data. But if our company is not under a contract to provide our privacy data to the government, it's not considered CUI, at least not in that context. In a different context, if you're an HR services company and you're handling all sorts of other people's privacy data because of HR related stuff and you're under a contract with the government to provide that to the government, then that privacy data becomes CUI. But until the government asks you for the information under contract, that information is not CUI. Also, you want to understand what type of files might contain your government information, not just CUI, but government information, right? Is it an email? Are you sending emails back and forth with the government? Are you sending Word documents? Do you have CAD files potentially? Do you have schematics and diagrams where you're performing engineering services on here? And then which vendors support your government contracts, right? Because not every single vendor that you have is providing you a good or a service that you're incorporating into a government project. Yep, okay, so I want to, go back here before I go to the next screen. But right, so which vendors support your contract? And then understanding your business. How is your business handling the government information? Again, not everything that your business does potentially is in support of a government contract. So you may have this whole ecosystem set up, but if the government contract that you're receiving, this government information for, you may not be using it in your whole environment. It may just be a portion of it or just a portion of your workforce. So truly understanding which part of your business is supporting the government will help more granularly fine-tune your understanding of where CUI resides in your environment. So I asked ChatGPT to create a fake defense contractor with a description of that they're a mid-sized defense contractor that designs, installs, and maintains a physical security and monitoring system for the DoD. We're going to go through this little exercise to kind of tease out the finer points on how to identify where the CUI might be in your environment. So from a higher level perspective, the first thing you want to identify is the government information in general, because if it's not government information, it cannot be CUI. But if it's government information, it's either FCI or CUI, or classified via classified contracts. But for the sake of this exercise, let's pretend this is a defense contractor. They're maintaining physical security and monitoring systems for DoD installation. It's not a classified system. It's either CUI or FCI. These are the types of documents and artifacts that may be generated either by you or given to you by the government or generated by a supplier or vendor or third party and given to you. There's all sorts of documents and things going on that potentially relate to government information. They're not all going to be CUI necessarily. They're not all going to be one category of information. So being able to understand what each one of these does and contains within it is the first step in figuring out where the government information is within your environment. But again, not all of your information, not all of your government information is going to fall into the category of CUI. So how do we figure out if this government information is in fact CUI? The very first thing that you're going to do is go to the National Archives CUI registry. They are the only agency that is allowed by law to have the official list of CUI categories. So this is just a snippet of categories. And if you're new to my channel, as my daughter on YouTube would say, if you've never looked at the CUI registry, these organizational index groupings, these are just helpful categories of groupings. They don't really mean anything. There's a defense category that aligns to these categories of CUI, but there can be CUI for defense contractors that fall outside of this category. For one, export controlled. ITAR information is export controlled information, but it's not neatly within this defense category. So with a better understanding of your government information that your company handles, when you go to this registry, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to scan the list to see which categories potentially align to what your company does. So I found that this pretend company that we're using for this exercise, I believe they align to the DoD critical infrastructure security information. So what you do is you would click on that link and it opens a second website, a second page, and it takes you to a page where it defines this category of CUI. And it tells you what the marking is, and it tells you, right, so this banner marking right here, sorry, this CUI, this is what you would write if you're marking and labeling CUI information. This is the category marking that you would use for it. This is a description of the category based on this, and this is all on the same page. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see some categories have lots of files down here, and this one just has one. But this will give you that government-wide policy, rule, regulation that requires extra protection for this category of information. Because if you remember, the official definition of CUI is something to the effect of like, information that's not for public release, that is produced for on behalf of the government, that requires, some sort of special protections. And this is the authority that provides that special protection. And then there's two types of CUI, or two flavors. There's basic and specified. This one is basic, meaning that you can label it just as CUI. If it was specified, you would have to always use this designation for marking and labeling. But since this is basic, you can just use the plain CUI. So after reading this definition and potentially going to this original source to figure out why this information is protected, you should have a really good idea about what this information entails and understanding how your information potentially overlaps with it. So the next step you would do is you would look at your information and figure out, does this truly meet the definition of CUI? Most people, most businesses that I've worked with in these types of engagements, they seem really nervous or scared or almost like they don't have the authority to designate something as CUI. But I would argue that we should use the preponderance standards to designate CUI. For those who have not gone to law school, who may not know, I just graduated from law school. I'm studying for the bar exam next month. And in law, in the courts, in civil cases, and also in criminal cases, there's standards of proof. Did somebody have something? Oh, sorry. There's several different burdens of proof in the courts. And so I would argue that for designating CUI, we should adopt a preponderance of the evidence standard like they do in most civil cases. The common law definition of what preponderance of the evidence means that if it's more likely than not true, then we can designate it as CUI, meaning if in your mind, if you're looking at your information, you're looking at this definition of CUI, and if you're 50.01% sure that it's CUI, you should designate it as CUI because it's beyond the preponderance of evidence that you believe it's CUI. Now, there's higher standards that you could adopt, but if you adopt a higher standard, then you may be in the cycle of never making a decision and really having no idea and wanting somebody to just tell you the answer. Clear and convincing evidence, it's an elevated civil standard for significant interest cases, things like limiting parental rights, right? Or having somebody civilly committed or taking away any sort of fundamental rights from a person, you have this really elevated standard. I don't believe CUI should fall into that category, and I'll explain more in a minute. And then beyond a reasonable doubt, this is the standard for convicting somebody in criminal court. There should be no reasonable doubt that this person is not guilty of this crime. So based on these, three broad standards of proof from the court systems, I think we should adopt for designating CUI this preponderance of the evidence. If you are more than 50% certain that something falls into CUI, designate it as CUI. And here's why. So 32 CFR per 2002, this is Title 32. It defines the controlled unclassified information. So in 2010, when the executive order established the CUI program, it followed up, the government followed up with this 32 CFR to outline all of the various definitions and terms that are used in the CUI program. So in 32 CFR, they define an authorized holder as an individual, an agency, an organization, a group of people who are authorized to handle the CUI, but you're also authorized to designate it. And this is what kind of freaks a lot of people out is they're afraid to designate something as CUI. But if you're an authorized holder, you are absolutely authorized to designate CUI as CUI. So what does designating CUI mean? It means that when an authorized holder, consistent with this law, determines that specific information falls into a CUI category or subcategory, you're allowed to designate it, and you're supposed to alert everybody the information being in your document and your stuff. You're obligated to do this. It's not I should do it. It's you must do it because this is what the law requires. And I would like to point out that in this designation rule, they did not establish a burden here. They didn't say beyond a preponderance or a reasonable doubt. They were kind of silent on the level of evidence necessary in order to designate, which is why I'm advocating for a preponderance of evidence standard. So if you believe more than 50% sure that it's CUI, then designate it as CUI. All right. So with this newfound understanding of what CUI is relative to it not being CUI, you would go back through the same list of the types of documents and all the things that your business handles that contains government information, and you do that extra level of deep dive. And for the sake of this exercise, I've highlighted in orange the things that I believe could be CUI. And this is exactly what your company should be doing, is going back through this whole list, and for every single thing on this list, all the information contained within, not just the title of the document, but the substance of the document, ask yourself, is this information more likely than not CUI? So if you're reading a contract data requirement, or CDRL, or an invoice, and you're reading the substance of the information, ask yourself, is this CUI? And if it's 50.01% or higher, then yes, designate it as CUI. So what's the next step after you determine that the substance of these documents are CUI? You'll want to go in and look at the different types of files, right, that could handle CUI. So a this is a Word document. So you know that this has the potential of being on a computer, sent over email, like all the places that a Word document could be. These other types of files that I don't interact with on a daily basis, maybe they belong to an obscure software or some other sort of platform that would indicate that that platform also handles CUI because these file types contain CUI. So what's the next thing that you do? You go to each one of these places where these file types exist to designate those assets as CUI assets, and then to make sure that whoever's handling those types of files are also included in your CMMC scope. So back to this diagram again. So we've done all of this understanding which files could contain CUI, which file types contain CUI. Then you go back to overlay that on top of your workflow and your systems, right? So you start to understand, okay, between the government and us, we're sending PDFs and Word documents. Oh, and to my suppliers, I'm sending this type of file through a platform online, and they're uploading them back. So there's no email exchange here. That's great. Then you also talk about how, internally are sending it to these suppliers, are, putting it through a platform, or you're uploading CUI into the cloud in these file formats, which also probably have some other software that use it. And you may also be able to identify what's not handling CUI. I don't know why this has a bunch of red lines on the screen. I don't know if you can see them, but mine. Anyway, but you may be able to rule out parts of your environment that do not actually handle CUI, which is great because then you can use that to reduce the ultimate scope and the cost of your CMMC compliance. All right, so back to this list again. So the next logical step would be you've reduced your scope for yourself by scoping out the things that are not in scope at all. They're out of scope entirely because they're logically or physically removed. Then you've done that further deep dive to understand specifically which handle CUI and which don't. And if you can remove those things that are not CUI, remove those things. Yep. You can remove everything that's not CUI from your environment. You could potentially remove them either physically or logically so that they don't have to be incorporated at all. But if you can't do that, at least designate them as contractor risk managed asset. Again, this will reduce your compliance costs because you don't have to pay to comply with CMMC for the things that are not in scope or if they're contractor risk managed assets. But subcontractor documentation, right, in your supply chain, because CUI doesn't always just stop at your company. Sometimes there's a need to share information with other vendors in order to get them to provide goods or services for your contracts, and being able to understand what you're sending them and what they are potentially sending back can also help reduce the costs of complying. So again, which are these documents that you're sending, which of these are actually CUI? Because not everything can actually be CUI. So again, I asked ChatGPT to create some sort of list of vendors that would provide goods or services to this type of company to identify where the CUI might be exchanged in the subcontractor information. So if you're providing facility security to defense facilities, you're probably going to have a physical security integrator and then some sort of cyber or network engineer, as well as the general construction and facilities contracting, as well as monitoring and security operations. And then random hardware and equipment. So again, not all of these are going to contain CUI. Some of them will inherently, but not everything. So for example, the security system schematics, camera placement, absolutely, because this reveals security information about the facility, and that is absolutely in line with the definition, the CUI definition that we're dealing with. Same with cyber network engineering. Absolutely CUI, because it's describing how these communications are going to be happening. And if an adversary were to get hold of that, they could potentially figure out exactly how they want to get into that network. But I want to point out this one right here. It's highlighted in orange because does a construction company that receives facility drawings, fencing layouts, guard posts, do they handle CUI? And the answer is maybe, because something that is not CUI can become CUI by adding additional details. And conversely, a file with lots of information, if you remove certain types of information, it can bring it from CUI down to FCI, to where it's not CUI. So this is another reason why understanding what exactly the definition of CUI is in your context, so that you can try to eliminate the information you don't need to send, so that that information does not become CUI. So here's a generic facility layout, again, created by ChatGPT. There's some weird misspellings that I tried to fix. But if you're looking at this general facility layout right here, this type of schematic is probably available on Google Maps, right? It's not anything that's secret. It's not government proprietary. People can drive around. There's no fences. So marking this as CUI is kind of ridiculous. It's almost like public information at this point, because it's just out there in public. So if you're trying to, have a vendor provide general equipment and you want them to park it in the parking lot A, over here, there's no reason to require them to have a CMMC level 2 with a C3 PAO if they're just dropping off equipment in a parking lot. However, if you are hiring somebody to build your guard post locations and they need to integrate with all of the camera and security equipment, you probably have to send them a little bit more detailed drawing. And this is when it becomes CUI. So being able to create different overlays or different bits of information for different vendors can ultimately, determine what that category of information is, just based on the substance of the information here, and knowing when you can take it out and when you have to leave it in. So all of this to say that understanding CUI will ultimately reduce your risk and costs. The first overarching reason, like major reason, is internally. If you reduce your CUI scope, then you minimize your assessment requirements, right? You can accurately point out which assets handle CUI, even if they're all still in the same environment. Yes, you have to talk about them all on the SSP, but if you can accurately point out which assets are not touching CUI and develop appropriate security policies or standards or procedures to ensure that these assets do not get CUI, you do not have to assess those assets against NIST 800-171. And then additionally, limiting the CUI sent to your supply chain. If you can not send vendors, but if you don't need to send them CUI, do not send them CUI. Why does this reduce cost? It's because it's reducing your vendor's compliance costs. It's not a guarantee that all primes are going to follow suit and make common sense decisions about requiring CMMC, but if you have small mom and pop shops in your supply chain and complying with CMMC is an incredibly expensive endeavor, if you can not send them CUI, you will save them money and ultimately save yourself money, because they'll either add cost to their goods and services, or they will be forced to leave the supply chain because they can't protect this. They can protect FCI, but if they don't need to and shouldn't be handling CUI, then you shouldn't be sending it to them. And also you reduce risk by reduce the risk of CUI mishandling. If you're sending people CUI that don't need it, who aren't fully educated or trained, or they don't handle this type of information by a matter of course, it's going to be a huge culture shift for them to have to start protecting everything with NIST 800-171 when they don't actually need to do that. So I don't have anything else to present, so I wanted to leave enough time for questions. If anybody has any questions, I think there's a Q&A that you guys can type into, or you can raise your hand and we'll try to unmute people. I don't know. I thought this would take a lot longer, but I apologize. I talked really quickly. I'll pause for a second. See if anybody.
I have actually just a question about flow down for SaaS vendors. Like, what would you recommend as a strategy for that if you're working with a vendor that's business critical but isn't CMMC?
Well, do they handle CUI?
Yeah.
Yeah. If they handle CUI, then they have to either be FedRAMP authorized at the moderate or higher level, or FedRAMP equivalent, meaning they've implemented the NIST 853 at the moderate baseline. So if you know that a software handles CUI, you have to make sure that they are compliant, because that's on, you may not be able to flow down the DFARS clause because it's probably a contract of adhesion, right? Meaning you don't have the ability to negotiate that contract. They're going to give you the T's and C's, the terms and conditions, and you sign them if you want the software, or you don't if you don't. But before you sign for that software, read the security documentation to see if they are FedRAMP authorized, or if they're FedRAMP compliant, and if they have a body of evidence or some sort of evidence that they can give you to show how they're compliant with those NIST controls. I understand that most companies probably have a bunch of software already, and then the CMMC stuff popped up, or the NIST 800-171 popped up. So it's really hard to transition away from a solution if they're not going to be compliant. So it's another business decision, either creating an enclave with new software vendors, or, you know, if that vendor is compliant, then you're still able to use it. But I would, before purchasing any software, review their security documentation, or their attestations, or their authorizations, or their SOC 2s, or whatever they have available. You should be asking that before making that purchase, and before putting government information into that software.
What if I could install it directly in my enclave? Am I required to be compliant, or are they required to be compliant at that point?
If it's in your environment, that part, so understanding what controls they've applied in their software and what controls you need to apply around it, then it doesn't really matter, because it's like a COTS thing that they've like delivered. So you're now responsible for it, unless there's an agreement in place where they're responsible and they provide patches, or they provide whatever they're providing has to be compliant. But that would be where the obligation kind of ends, because it really is where the CUI flows. So if the CUI is flowing to that company because they need a back door to get in to patch stuff, then it kind of opens up a whole can of worms. But if everything is like delivered on site and you're managing it, or their patches involve some sort of download or install, then you're making sure you're testing that stuff before you put it into your CUI environment. So I guess the answer is it depends. Yeah. So
Another one I heard from a customer was if they had CAM files, and that those basically output binary that were sent to CNC machines that were operated by personnel that didn't have access to CUI. Like, what do you do in that case?
yeah, you said they don't have access or can't have access to CUI?
Well, they have access. The machines receive the instructions as binary. The operators don't have direct access to the binary, and if they did, they wouldn't have the facility on the machine to read it. It's only usable by the machine. Is there any requirement there that I would need to worry about?
Well, I guess the output, what's the output of the machine, right? If it's
That's basically
a widget?
PCB. Yeah.
Yeah. So the widget itself is not a bit of information. It's you still protect it, right? From public disclosure, you don't leave it out in the open. But it kind of falls outside the scope of a security control that NIST 800-171 has. I would handle the PCB itself, like the widget. I would handle it as if it's like a printed version of CUI, where you have like physical security controls. But as far as the file type itself, are the ones and zeros part of an ITAR covered bit of information? The government, I can't remember which agency it was, just a couple weeks ago, opined on this kind of thing. They said that, encrypting, and I know that binary is not the same as encryption, but it's the same unreadable to the human eye, unless you're really a huge nerd and can just read binary. You can't read it, but it doesn't change the nature of the information. It's still at its core being CUI. It's just not in a readable format. So it depends on what you do with it, right? So if you're decrypting it, it turns back into legible CUI, and then that endpoint should be protected according to NIST. But if it's just generating a widget, then you've got this widget that should be controlled and protected according to, how you would protect paper CUI potentially. Don't leave it in public, handle it in a controlled environment. Hopefully the people working with those widgets are allowed to have it. And if it's ITAR, that they're US persons, but yeah, I guess that would, because every business I've ever worked with is different in process and in workflow and in restrictions and in physical environment. So it really just depends, but it's going back to this preponderance of the evidence standard. If you're 50.01% certain that you're doing the right thing, that's what's required, right? The civil standard of evidence in cases, if you're proving anything in civil court, it's a preponderance of the evidence standard. So I would not see why that should not apply here, meaning it should apply here as well. If you're 50.01% certain that you've protected it at every step of the way, then that should be sufficient. And again, compliance should be a sufficiency standard, not a, unfortunately, it's not a industry standard. It's a minimally sufficient requirement.
It looks like we have a question from Todd. Todd, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
All right, thanks. Yeah, going on dovetailing to the last comments, our group are actually in that exact scenario. We're a subcontractor. We do testing of printed circuits. So we also, the CNC files are basically a mathematical XY coordinate, and it goes out and either drills holes or makes a shape or something like that. So the operators, even though our group, we're all ITAR compliant and all that, that gets fuzzy. But my main question is we are fall into the subcontractor clause for military primes. And we do, what we get from them is technical data. And the challenge for us is both being doing ITAR, and I'm the liaison, and I talked to the Department of State, and where the CUI confirmation comes from, depending on the military prime, goes through a circuit board manufacturer, and we are third down the line. And how we're supposed to, is it CUI for us or is it not CUI for us? When I asked this question to the Department of State in the ITAR world, they say, well, most of the time what you're getting is a piece of a bigger puzzle, right? So you're getting, they're building a Hummer, but you're working on the rear wheel. You can't make the whole thing and you can't disclose the whole thing. And so the Department of State sometimes will say that's commercial, where the military guys are giving it to a prime and saying, okay, this part is CUI, which I can understand that. But the challenge for us sometimes is, even though our circuit board manufacturer, who's also struggling with CMMC2, most of our group are going to be level 2, unless you are the prime, right? So they have a tendency to throw, I would say, more than reasonable amount of information that they flow down and say, oh, it's CUI. And so that's a struggle for us. And so I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. Us trying to be CMMC2 personally attestable to level 2, it's difficult because when I just listen to you, I can go back to a meeting today and say, we can challenge most of this information that's coming to us and whether or not we need to. I mean, obviously we have a security plan that we're working on all that. We want to do it personally, but all this work to be required and all that. And when I can actually challenge some of this thing, is that really? So that's my question. Thanks.
Yeah. And in fact, that's what 32 CFR part 2002. I would encourage everybody to go look it up. It's not hard to read at all. If you go to the Cornell's legal website, it's also super easy to read, and they have like links to words that are defined. But it very much tells you that over designating stuff as CUI is mishandling CUI. Like that is, it's a everybody seems to do it because they don't understand CUI. And every time I work with a small business, I wish every small business would push back on every higher level in the supply chain to explain to them what CUI is, because you know your business better than probably the level above you, and definitely better than the Department of State, right? The Department of State, I was a government employee for a few years, and I became a defense contractor for a lot more years. We didn't, being inside the government, we have no idea what industry is doing. We're just guessing, basing on reading articles and talking to folks, right? It's the people down here in the supply chain that actually understand the nature of their business and what they're doing and what they're producing and have access to the definition of CUI. So if it were me, absolutely, I would try to push back as much as I can, because it ultimately reduces your cost, but it would reduce their cost. If they didn't send all this stuff that they say is CUI but isn't, they didn't send that to all of their vendors, their cost would be cheaper, right?
Well, I mean,
So,
that's what it comes down to us for. You see this big looming thing. Well, if you misrepresent yourself as being CUI or SMC2, you're looking at $10 billion worth of fines and going to jail. And it's like that they're scaring us into spending money to comply where we can actually challenge it. And that's
so most to go to jail, most crimes require mens rea, a guilty frame of mind, to have the intent. So the good news is you're not probably going to go to jail if you're trying to do the right thing. And the right thing, according to 32 CFR Part 2002, the right thing is to not over designate, and it is to designate information as you see it as CUI. And if it's not CUI, it's not it's not CUI. So you could maybe try to work with the prime, or the level of a view in the supply chain, to see if they're open to a conversation. But what I would do is do the work yourself first and say, we're getting these types of information. This we believe is CUI. We believe it's this category, but this information over here, we do not believe it's CUI because it doesn't meet any of these requirements. What do you guys think? Or kind of put it back on them, but doing the homework for them so that it's a lot harder for them to say no, because they probably haven't done that work either.
okay. Thanks.
Yeah, good luck. I was in DoD CIO or OUSD ANS, where the CMMC was invented. We were struggling with this question about the supply chain and why aren't they protecting CUI, and they had no idea. Like, they didn't have any idea. They were trying to publish, things that would help the supply chain understand it, but they don't understand industry. So it's really hard from a top down, from the DoD, to push down guidance when they truly don't have any understanding on a intricate functional workflow level what is being produced and what information looks like.
We offer a consultation for free. If you like, and if you want to go into more detail, or if you want to bring your SME so that we can actually understand in more detail exactly what it is, and we can provide more clarity. But there's an opportunity, if you'd like, if you can avail yourself of that. And then also, if you had questions out of bound of this, we'd also, like, you send them to us by email or whatever, we do our best to take a stab at it.
Any other questions? Otherwise, that's all I have. Martine, if you want to.
Yeah, no, thanks, Leslie. Really appreciate the information today. As usual, it was really insightful, and I know everyone here appreciates it. Just as kind of Joe was just mentioning, there's really two components to CMMC Launchpad. The first part is free kind of resources to be your kind of one-stop shop for information on CMMC and things like kind of Leslie just described, and the series of webinars, which she gives a lot of different topics that we can cover, but also resources, whether they're available through the government, either from like a state, local, and potential even like, funding streams, legal resources. Those things you may need to avail of yourself going down this path. And then also with that consultation portion to kind of better understand, your company's kind of unique environment and requirements to get you set up for the right path. And what you may need, just like as this conversation between Leslie and Todd just played out, which maybe maybe the answer might be pushing back on some of like the requirements that are being placed on you because you really don't maintain CUI. So those types of conversations we'd like to have with each of you, and then also we've put together a bundled set of solutions and services that would help you really get the foundation if you need to go down. And this will be full encompassing, so all the way from people on the level 1 all the way to get you through level 2 third-party assessment, if that is in fact what you may need through our partner network. So please reach out to us, visit our website, see the resources that are potentially available. You provide us feedback if there's anything else you would like to see that would be helpful to your company. We'll get that content produced for you. Again, this is intended to be a one-stop shop kind of resource for CMMC. And then also these seminars are being recorded and posted on YouTube. So we'll send out that link as well after this seminar closes, probably later this week. That's all for us. We appreciate everyone's time here today, and we look forward to seeing you on a future session. Have a good afternoon, y'all.
Bye.